Today we're diving into how criminal courts work and what sentencing means. And we're going to break down what criminal law is, how it's different from other kinds of rules, what the courts look like, and what happens when someone is sentenced. And by the end of this session, you should have a solid grip on the basics and some big ideas to think about for your A-level studies. Let's start with criminal law, the basics and key principles. So what is it? Well, criminal law is all about stopping certain acts that are seen as bad for society, setting out punishments when people break those rules. Its main aim is to keep everyone safe, protect property, and help communities run smoothly. Next, we have the presumption of innocence. Now, this means every single person accused of a crime starts out innocent. And it's up to the government, the prosecution, to prove they're guilty and not the other way round. They don't have to prove that they're innocent. Next, we have the burden and standard of proof. Only the prosecution has to show the person's guilt, and that, as we said, and they have to do it beyond reasonable doubt. And this means that the evidence has to be really convincing. And there's an important key case that this is based on, which is the case of Woolmington versus the Department of Public Prosecutions from 1935. This was a famous case and it made it clear. It's always up to the prosecution to prove someone's guilt. And this rule became, one of the building blocks of English criminal law. So let's take a look at some legal rules and how they differ from moral rules and social norms as well. So to start with, we've got legal rules there. So these are the official rules made by parliaments or court. And if you break one, you could be fined or sent to prison. So theft and assault are really good examples there. Next, we have moral rules. Now, these are about what's right or wrong according to society, or perhaps to religion, or perhaps even just to your own values. You won't go to court for breaking these. However, people might disapprove. For example, lying to a friend isn't against the law, but it is frowned on. Then we have social norms, which are everyday expectations like queuing or saying thank you. And if you ignore these, you might just get a few odd looks. Sometimes legal rules match up with moral values, but not always. And there are plenty of debates about things like euthanasia, which has been in the news recently, or freedom of speech, where law and morals don't really line up. Some other examples like stealing. That is both illegal and morally wrong. However, cheating on a partner, for example, isn't a crime. However, most people do say it is wrong. Another example is social norms like dressing smartly. Well, that isn't usually in the law, but they can still shape what laws get made. Think about laws on public decency, for example. Let's take a look at the criminal courts and who does what. So in England and Wales, criminal cases go through a series of courts, and each of these courts has its own job. Magistrates' Court first then. So almost all cases will start here. They deal with the less serious crimes and the first hearings for bigger ones. Next is Crown Court. So this handles the serious stuff. It also handles appeals from the court below, the Magistrates' Court. Next, you've got the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. I add that because we also have a civil division. But the criminal division, if someone in the Crown Court thinks their conviction or sentence wasn't fair, they can appeal here. And finally, we have the Supreme Court at the very top. Now, this only hears cases about very big legal questions. Some recent changes, courts are trying to be more efficient. They're trying to use things like digital hearings and new ways to sort things out. And this is especially so after the COVID pandemic. Let's take a closer look at the Magistrate Court. So magistrates' courts are usually run by 3 volunteer, lay, we call them, magistrates, or a district judge. And they handle about 95% of criminal cases. They can give fines, community orders, even a year a year in prison if it's for more than one offence. They're also going to handle bail, and then they send the most serious cases up to the Crown Court. So these courts are quick, they're local, that helps keep things efficient, keeps things moving. But people worry about them not always being consistent, and maybe about them also having rather limited powers. Next we have Crown Court. The Crown Court has a judge and, for trials, a jury of 12. It deals with the toughest crimes. It can give out long sentences, and it also hears appeals. It's more formal, and it usually costs more to go through, so there are concerns about delays and making sure everyone gets fair legal help. Next, we have the Court of Appeal. So the Court of Appeal looks at whether convictions and sentences from the Crown Court were fair, and appeals can be about new evidence, or maybe there was a mistake in the law during the trial, or some sort of unfairness during the trial. The court can confirm, it can change, or it can throw out convictions and sentences, or it can actually order a retrial. So appeals help fix the mistakes, don't they? And they keep things fair, but the system can be rather slow and complicated. Not every case gets appealed, especially since legal aid isn't always available. Moving on to sentencing principles. So, sentencing. This is guided by the Sentencing Act from 2020 and the Sentencing Council's rules. Judges think about how serious the crime was, what harm was done, and any good or bad things about the offender. So the aims of sentencing are retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and reparation. We also have proportionality to consider, so the sentence should fit both the crime and the person who did it. Let's take a look at sentencing adults. So the types of sentence a judge can hand down for an adult offender would be a custodial sentence, and this of course is prison for very serious offences, perhaps a community order, which is unpaid work, or rehabilitation programmes perhaps. Then fines, which is paying money out, and discharges. That means there's basically no further action, so that would be for very minor offences. If there are aggravating factors, like the defendant having a criminal record or violence, well then that might make the sentence tougher, while mitigating factors, so that would be things like early guilty plea or showing genuine remorse, that can lead to lighter sentences. So judges use the Sentencing Council guidelines, and that should keep things fair. There are some worries, there are always going to be worries, aren't there, about some sentences being a bit inconsistent and prisons being overcrowded. So sometimes short sentences don't often help in the long run. Youth sentencing now. So as you can imagine, for younger people aged between 10 and 17, the focus is on helping them change and keeping them out of trouble. So courts must think about what's best for the child and only really use custody as a last option. So what main youth sentences are available? Well, first of all, referral order. And this is when a panel sits down with the young person and works out a plan to fix what happened and avoid future trouble. Next, you have youth rehabilitation orders. So these are flexible community sentences. It could be something like a curfew, having to be in at a certain time, or maybe special programs that the person can join. And these could be tailored to help the young person get back on track. We also have detention and training orders. And this is going to be, of course, for the more serious cases. So it mixes a bit of time in custody in prison with some supervised support perhaps to help the young person learn and improve. So youth justice is moving towards more community solutions. But reoffending and whether custody is ever appropriate for young people, well, these are still things that we're debating. Let's go back to those sentencing theories we mentioned earlier. So when a judge chooses a sentence, they're thinking about a mix of ideas. Let's take a closer look. Retribution, which is giving people what they deserve, but of course that doesn't always stop future crimes. Deterrence, trying to scare off others and the offender, but it's hard to know if this works. The evidence is a little mixed. Rehabilitation next. Helping people change is important, helping people change is important, but it needs time, it needs resources as well. We have incapacitation, so protecting society is really important, especially with very dangerous offenders, but prison might not always be the answer. And finally, we have reparation, repairing the damage done. This encourages offenders to make amends, especially through some restorative justice programs, for example. So courts use a mix of these aims, but it is tough, isn't it, to try and get that balance right. Let's take a look at strengths, weaknesses now. So the strengths, well, courts aim to be fair with lots of checks like appeals and independent judges. There's an increasing focus on rehab and community sentencing, all good. The rule of law and separation of powers helps keep things unbiased. But in terms of weaknesses, well, the process can be slow. It can also be rather costly and sometimes inconsistent too. There's less funding for legal aid, and this is going to mean that not everyone gets fair or good representation. Prisons are overcrowded too, and there's lots of reoffending, which isn't great for society. Some reform ideas next. People want more restorative justice and fairer and more consistent sentencing, better funding for legal aid, and to use prison less, especially for minor crimes. The idea is to focus more on helping folks change and not necessarily on just locking them up. So let's just consider some big picture links or synoptic links. So in this context, synoptic means drawing connections between different topics or themes to see the bigger picture. Criminal courts do connect to big ideas like rule of law. Everyone is subject to the law, after all. Separation of powers, which we mentioned in our first session, and that means that judges are independent. And human rights, so they should be getting fair trials and fair sentences. The criminal justice system tries to balance justice, public safety, and helping offenders change. Sentences need to be fair, they need to fit each case, but they also need to keep things consistent. Ongoing debates show how important it is to keep adjusting what works and what society needs. Finally then, you also have some key cases here which it's important to learn.